functions, okay? The system functions that are available to you are gonna change depending on the type of form that you're in, and if you're in a form versus a UBE, which is a batch application. So, for example, a find browse form have system functions for manipulating the grid. The example I just did before with the insert grid buffer row, you're not going to get that available to you in this form because there is no grid you can add to this form. So if I look in the system functions here, oh, they're still there for some reason. They are there, but yeah, they're there, but they're not going to do anything. So the system functions that you use really depend on the type of form you're working with. So JDE organizes its system functions based on category. So the category is control. Control is have to do with the system functions for working with form controls. So form control are these. And on this form, they're these. Okay, they have system functions for working with the grid. So working with this and all the grid rows in it. They have parent child have to do with a special type of I won't get into that one right now. General is kind of like stuff that's used all over the place. So this is where I found the press button before. Okay. Let me go through. Combo boxes have to do with working with. Oh, I just crashed. With combo boxes. Combo boxes is like a drop-down list. So if you want to programmatically work with that drop-down list, system function to do that. So a lot of what the system function is going to do for you on a form is usually work with the controls, work with the grid, work with the form control, work with the look. It's not necessarily low level. It's allowing you to program at a higher level, but it's like, for example, when you work with like with um, JavaScript, there's methods for adding to a list to a combo box, right? There's methods for checking a checkbox. There's methods for I don't know, selecting radio buttons. These don't. No, system functions are not gonna write anything to do with. It's manipulating the visual. A lot of times they do. Yeah, a lot of times business function has something to do with some business logic, and it has something to do with retrieving data or saving that data somewhere. A lot of times, system functions is manipulating. When you're talking about an interactive application, it's manipulating the visual elements of the screen. So working with the different types of controls. These are all the different types of controls you can have. Push buttons, check boxes, regular text buttons, tab controls. You can have tabs where you can programmatically select a tab if you want. You can hide tabs. You can show tabs. You can hide an entire tab control. There's tons of things that you can do programmatically. So if you click a button, click this tab. You know, if the data in this field is a 1, select this tab. You know, you have complete control over working with that, but it's working with the visual elements. So that's mainly what your system functions are going to be categorized by the type of control. Form controls, grid, and grid columns. There's a special type of control called the tree control. It's like a directory listing, like this. Okay, that's for working with that type of tree. To be honest, I don't use that very often. I think I programmed maybe one, maybe even two programs like that. Um, and it's so long ago that I'm not gonna go into it. General is some general stuff that you can do. Combo box, text box, working with a calendar. There's a special calendar control. I programmed one application with calendar that's fairly new in the recent versions, recent tools releases. Um, the ones that I use the most, okay, the categories where I'm going to go in the most are control, grid, and general. Okay, because a lot of times you work with these things, okay, but the most majority of the stuff that you do that you've been doing so far, you have form controls, you have grids, and you got some general stuff that you want to do like press buttons. Okay, so the types of things you can do. Okay, uh, if I'm gonna go through, I'm gonna go through this, and this real quick, and tell you the ones that we're gonna use the most. Okay, so working with controls, one I can tell you that we're gonna work with a lot are enabling and disabling the control. So if like, for a lot of times what's going to happen is if maybe one control is dependent on another control. So if this one's selected, you want to make this one disabled. So that's how you would do it. You would put it on the event of one. You would say disable or enable. Um, the other one you would use a lot would be control error and clear control error. So set control error. JDE's runtime will automatically when you're on a form like this and something is wrong in your data. So for example, here, height. If you know what, I'm not going to go into that right now. I'm not going to go into that right now. Setting control errors is basically putting an error state in the form and highlighting. It shows the error message on the top. Right? And we went through this a little bit on one of the videos. It shows the error message on the top. It highlights the column in red, and it doesn't prevent you. It prevents you from going any further. That's setting control errors. When you're working with tabs, enable tab page and hide tab page, you're going to work with. Disable tab page, enable tab page, hide tab page, and show tab page text. Those are when you're working with the tab control. This one here. Tab control. Okay. So you can a tab page is you can hide an actual page on the tab programmatically. So why they didn't separate it out into a different category, I don't know. I would have had that under tab control, but they just have it all under control. And those are the ones, show control and hide control. Those are the ones I'm going to use. So basically, enabling and disabling a control will gray it out and not allow you to select it. Versus hiding it is just hides it from the screen. The user doesn't even see it. So that's enable, disable, hide, show. And then the error handling is set control error, clear control error. And when you're working with tabs, you're going to use the tab function. So hide tab page and show tab and disable tab page, that type of thing. So that's what you're working with in controls. In grid, there's some that you're going to work with a lot if you're programmatically programming any grids. So the one you're going to work with like a ton of times is set grid cell error. That is the same thing as set form control error, except you're setting an error for a specific cell in the grid. So you have to specify what column and what row has the error. Okay. So that one, you're going to work with a lot. Suppress grid line. Suppress grid line is if you want to tell the runtime to not show a line based on a condition. So, for example, you're looping through a bunch of records, and you don't want to show a record if it has a value of n for whatever reason. So as you're doing your grid, in the event of grid record is fetched, you're going to test the variable, and if the variable is no, you're going to call suppress grid line. It's just not going to write that grid line. I use that quite frequently. There's the insert grid buffer rows, and you're going to use a lot of the methods here. I'm not going to get into it in detail, but you're going to use a lot of the methods here to loop through grid records. So a lot of times you have a set of data that the user entered, and you want to programmatically loop through every single record that has been entered by the user and do something on screen with it, not necessarily in the database. An example would be a program that I wrote. It displays a total on the top. So it's got a form control with a total, and it summarizes everything that the user entered on the grid. So every time the user enters a new line, that total updates. So in order to calculate what that total is, you have to loop through the grid and calculate and summarize each of the columns. So there's a bunch of things to like get grid row, get max grid rows. It counts the number of rows that you have available to you. Enabling and disabling the grid. So sometimes when there's errors you haven't got there yet, but when there's an input grid, right now you've been working with the grids you've been working with or just browse. But when it's an input grid, a headerless detail, for example, sometimes you enter some data at a header, and if the data is invalid, you want to prevent them from entering any of the detail. So you disable the grid. You say, oh, you set an error and you disable the grid, so they can't type anything in the grid. And then once they fix the error, you re-enable the grid. That type of thing. You can set colors and fonts of the grid. I'm gonna leave it at that for now. And then the ones that you use here a lot, like the one I use 99% of the time, is press button, and probably the suppresses and the stop processing. So the suppress, okay, will tell the runtime not to do something. So for example, when you have a field like this, when you have a column like this, when you have a form like this that's attached to the business view, if I add a special, these are special buttons. Everything under file are special buttons. Runtime is manipulating them. That's add is a special one. Select is a special one. Delete is a special one. I can add delete here, and the runtime will automatically delete based on the key. Okay? I don't have to program any of the delete.
Middleware.
Yeah, the middleware. When I say runtime, it's the middleware that's doing that. Okay? So the middleware will delete that record for me. If I want to tell the middleware, don't delete the record, I would use that system function, suppress delete. Okay, suppress find. I want to tell the middleware, when you click that find button, don't do a find. Stop finding. So there's an error on the form I don't want to find, for example. remove is you're basically tapping into the runtime or to the middleware, saying, don't do what you're supposed to do. What you would normally do, don't do it.
It's like the jQuery file.
Suppress update. When I'm in this form here,
Yeah.
and I have this selected, the runtime or the middleware will do an update as soon as you click the OK button, right? But if I want to suppress that, can you give me a little 5 minutes? I'm gonna be there.
Oh,
The the runtime will automatically update when I click the OK button. If I want to tell the runtime don't update, suppress update. If I if I'm in add mode, it's not going to do an update. It's going to do an add. If I want to tell the runtime don't do an add, suppress add. And I have specific events where I can call that. Update record to DB before. Suppress. Suppress my update. It won't update anything. It'll because it's before the update happened. Don't update anything. Same thing here. Add record to DB before. Suppress add. It won't add anything.
okay.
Okay, so these are system functions that you use, and you use them. Sometimes what you do, you use them for two reasons. One would be an error condition usually,
Yeah.
and you want to suppress a delete, but usually you use them to work around default behavior.
Yeah.
So you say you want the runtime behavior for most of your application, but for this specific thing, I don't want the runtime to handle it. I'll handle it. So you suppress the delete, for example. Okay. Um, that's what you would use that for. And stop processing, okay, is one that you see. Um, this is like you could kind of think of it as like a return. So you're in an event and you're programming it. The event is running through, and you got let's say you have an error condition and you have some code down here,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't want to run that code if that error condition is met. So you stop processing the event. So it won't. Once you call that the event that you're in, it'll stop processing. So for example, here if I have some code here, that code will never execute because this I said stop processing, so it stops processing this event. So normally you put this in like you don't just stop processing like that. Normally you put this in an if, and you say if something happens, stop processing. And well, first you set an error and then you stop processing.
Mm-hmm.
So you tell the user, hey, there's an error, but I don't want the rest of my event to process.
Okay.
So I stop the processing.
It's like a return.
It's like a return. Yeah,
Okay.
it's like a return. It's like a return, but in the context of an event.
Yeah, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And those are basically the ones you're gonna use the most. So what I would do um, would be to kind of like look into those ones first because
Yes.
the other ones are a little more advanced in different types of forms, but you're gonna use them more often, especially the grid, on a headerless detail form, which I didn't go through it with you yet.
Yeah.
But but a lot of times you're using the grid functions for a headerless detail.
Mm-hmm.
I do use them for the browse as well, but more often for a headerless detail
Mm-hmm.
because you're programmatically doing something um, depending on what the user input, right? Uh, a lot of you can get by with like super little system functions,
Okay, I see.
right?
Yeah.
You can program a very basic application and it'll be functional, and you can have zero system functions in there
Yeah.
because this runtime takes care of it. As long as your database matches your files and your business views match your screens,
Yes.
you're gonna get by without any of it, right? And that again, what Jeremy was complaining about was that the screens are so unuser friendly. Why? Because they match the data
I see.
100%.
Yes.
So a lot of times what I'm doing is I'm trying to make the screen more user friendly.
Gotcha.
So I scrap the default behavior of JDE
Okay.
and I program it myself. I say,
Based on
go grab the data
data
here, go grab data here, go grab data here, save data there, save data there, save data there. I'm doing that through table input output, through business functions, through data, through retrievals of data, and I'm just summarizing it all in one screen.
Okay.
The first application that I built was product creation. Okay, product creation. There was probably like 15 to 25 screens that somebody had to go through
Okay.
because there's 15 to 25 tables
That
that store the data, right?
Okay.
So it was screen to screen to screen to screen to screen. What I did is to make it more efficient is I consolidated all that piece of information
In one.
and I put it in one screen. But then I had to scrap the JDE behavior because JDE is not going to write to all those tables for me,
Okay.
right? So then I had to program it all myself through system functions, through table input output, through event rules basically.
Yeah.
So that's where you see the system functions and event rules coming in more and more and more is when you want to scrap the default runtime behavior.
Okay.
But usually what you're doing is you're kind of like taking a combination of the both.
Okay.
You're gonna have a screen that has table input output. A screen that you're gonna like 90% of it you're gonna use the default behavior, but then you're gonna add your own system functions and whatever to kind of enhance it.
Okay.
That's it.